So what actually happens when an entire generation just completely forgets its history? It's a pretty profound question, right? Today, we're diving into this explainer to look at the ancient second-generation problem and how it triggers the kind of massive societal shifts that we honestly still see echoing today. Welcome to our explainer on the Book of Judges. We're going to unpack a truly fascinating era of ancient Israel. We are talking about a time defined by deep societal decay, incredibly chaotic geopolitics, and some deeply, deeply flawed leaders. Here is our quick roadmap for today. We'll cover the second-generation problem, the cycle of apostasy, what it meant to be a land without a king, 4 flawed deliverers, and then we'll wrap it all up with the ultimate lesson. All right, let's jump right into Section 1, the second-generation problem. So, the really crucial point here is that the generation following the great leader Joshua entirely forgot the covenant their parents had just promised to keep. Literally, a whole new generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. It's a nasty problem, isn't it? Vital convictions simply vanish if they aren't personally owned. The preceding generation had lived through radical transformations, but because these kids didn't personally own those experiences, their society's moral foundation just quickly crumbled. Which brings us to Section 2, the cycle of apostasy. First off, we've got to define apostasy. It actually comes from a Greek root that literally translates to stand away from. So, this wasn't just a mere accident or some casual mistake. It was an intentional, deliberate turning away from their core commitments so they could serve local idols instead, like the Baals and Ashtoreths. And this brilliantly illustrates the vicious cycle they found themselves trapped in. It's essentially a 4-step trap. Step 1, intentional apostasy and idolatry. Step 2, suffering brutal oppression by local raiders, which served as a form of divine chastisement. Step 3, the people inevitably crying out in great distress and repentance. And finally, Step 4, deliverance by a leader, or judge, who was raised up to save them. But here's the real tragedy. Once that judge died, they wouldn't just repeat the trap. No, they'd return to ways that were even more corrupt than before. Let's move on to Section 3, a land without a king. You see, there was this massive disconnect at play here. On paper, Israel was supposed to be this ideal theocracy, right? Centralized worship at the tabernacle in Shiloh, covenant peace, priests teaching the Torah, the whole shebang. But the harsh reality, it was much, much darker. We're talking intertribal warfare, localized oppression, and disparate, self-contained tribal units just frantically fending for themselves without any centralized rule. And geopolitically speaking, just picture where Israel is situated at this time. They are primarily living up in the central Hill Country. So they're essentially acting like a giant nutcracker, getting violently pinched by the Moabites and Ammonites on the east and the Philistines on the west. And to make matters worse, they're constantly being raided by semi-nomadic Midianites who just sweep in like locusts to steal their crops. It was an absolute recipe for constant, localized conflict. Now for Section 4, 4 flawed deliverers. Let's map out our character study for this era. We're looking at 4 major judges: Deborah, Gideon, Jephthah, and Samson. Now, they faced massive enemies, from the king of Hazor all the way to the Philistines, and they actually won some incredible victories. But there's a huge catch. Their incredible divine callings are completely juxtaposed against their very human and sometimes totally disastrous fatal flaws. First up, we have the reluctant, Deborah and Barak taking on the kingdom of Hazor. Deborah was this fiery prophetess with massive clout. She held court and people from all over brought their cases directly to her. She commanded Barak to fight the enemy general Sisera, but Barak's fatal flaw? A complete lack of courage. He actually hesitated and flat-out refused to go without her. And because of that hesitation, the honor of slaying the enemy general went to a woman named Jael instead. Next is Gideon. To really get a sense of where he starts out, picture the way people farmed back then. Normally, you'd thresh grain very publicly on a breezy hilltop. But Gideon, he was hiding out, threshing his grain down in a tiny, cramped stone wine pit just to hide his food from those massive hordes of Midianite raiders we talked about earlier. So yeah, he started out completely uncertain and absolutely terrified. But God meets Gideon's uncertainty with these gracious signs, eventually whittling his massive army of 32,000 down to literally just 300 men. And get this, they weren't even armed with swords. They carried trumpets and clay jars. This was specifically to ensure that the victory over the Midianites was purely based on faith, not on military might. However, Gideon had a fatal flaw of his own: pride. Even though he publicly refused to become king, he boldly went ahead and named his son Abimelech, which literally translates to, "My father is king." Even worse, he used plundered gold to create an ephod, which is a priestly garment, that the Israelites very quickly began to worship. It became this massive idolatrous snare to his own family and really the entire nation. Let's move on to Jephthah and see how this pattern builds. Now, to understand his story, it really helps to know a bit about classic Israelite houses from that era. Families frequently kept their animals right on the ground floor to provide heat during the winter. That architectural detail is absolutely critical because it perfectly explains what Jephthah was expecting when he made an incredibly tragic vow. Here is the tragedy. Jephthah promised God that if he won the Ammonite war, he would sacrifice whatever came out of the doors of his house first upon his return. Given how those houses were structured, he fully expected an animal to wander out. But when his one and only daughter walked out first to greet him, his pagan-influenced superstitions, which had strayed way far from Orthodox teachings, led him to feel bound to a devastating and horrifyingly tragic vow. Finally, we have Samson, the Vengeful. He was a judge meant to fight the Philistines, a man under a special Nazirite vow with the supernatural strength to literally rip the massive city gates off Gaza and carry them 2,600 feet up a mountain. Yet, he was completely compromised by his fatal flaws. He had this insatiable lust for cosmopolitan Philistine culture and a relentless spirit of personal vengeance, rather than actually seeking true justice for his people. All right, let's bring it all together in Section 5, the ultimate lesson. So, what are the main takeaways from all this? Well, first, disobedience to the covenant practically guarantees chastisement. Second, this is a really messy era where chronologies actually overlap in the chaos, meaning different tribes were fighting localized battles at the exact same time. Third, and kind of wonderfully, Providence relentlessly utilizes deeply flawed humanity to achieve its goals. And finally, this intense decentralization directly points to the historical stage being set for Israel's desperate need for a centralized king. There's this dramatic, repeating quote from the text that just brilliantly captures the essence of the entire era. In that day, everyone did what was fit in their own eyes. It perfectly highlights the utter lack of centralized rule, because without a shared moral anchor, the entire society just experienced a total, devastating downward spiral. So, to leave you with a final thought on this explainer, when we look back at this brutal cycle of societal decay, we really have to ask ourselves, where is the balance between decentralized freedom and centralized authority? Does ultimate freedom, when stripped of a shared moral anchor, simply become chaos? Thank you so much for joining me to explore this fascinating period of history. Keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.